Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you again, even if it is a virtual presence. I did comment after Monday's lecture that I am very much a face-to-face person, and I do find it a little bit strange to be in this situation. But let's try to at least make the Q&A as interactive as possible, and then in the individual tutorial sessions also, of course. I am, in any case, as I already mentioned on Monday, extremely grateful to the organizers for facilitating my participation in the school in sort of complicated personal situation, but at least I'm able to be with you and to share some of what I had originally planned to do with you. I'm going to share the screen now, so could you just need to confirm to me that you can see my screen? Is that okay?
Right. Yes, we do see it.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. Lecture 2 is very directly related to Lecture 1. In Lecture 1 the other day, what I attempted to do was look at an overview of how institutions can put together translator education programs, many of the elements which they need to take into account. No pretension at all at exhaustivity, because in a 1-hour lecture it is very, very difficult to go into all the details, and there are lots of elements that we didn't have time to look at in detail. But one of the major elements, which is a serious problem for many universities when they're setting up their translator education programs, and this holds also for interpreting, although I tend to speak much more about translation, is that of human resources, but human resources from the academic, from the educator point of view. And so, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
The camera shot, we're not getting even your whole face. Would you mind either backing your...
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Let's see. Down, up? Because I can't see myself right now. I can't see myself right now, so it's hard for me to...
All right.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try not to move my head around too much. That's the other thing. I tend to move around. So
it's good. Movement is good.
Right. Sure. Okay. I just may go out of shot occasionally. That's the only...
That's fine.
Okay, I normally lecture standing up and walking around. So you can imagine that sitting still in front of a computer camera is a little bit unusual for me.
Yes, I totally feel you. Yep. All right. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so some virtual walking around then. So today what I would like to look at, as I said, is who are the educators when we set up a translator education program? Who do we need as trainers? What should their profile be, and how do we help to develop that profile? This is a recurrent problem, as I said, at universities. I have seen it happen and lived through it very intensely in Spain, as the number of translation programs grew exponentially in the 1990s. And I have then seen it also happen in countries like Poland, like Turkey, where suddenly there has been a plethora of new translation programs. And today, I think, and I know we have scholars from China in the group, I have seen a very similar situation in China, a situation which I was able to discuss with Chinese colleagues at the WITA International Conference only 3 weeks ago. So what I would like to do is take the issue from various different points of view, and I'd just like to start by having a quick look at what some of our colleagues in translation studies have said about trainer profiles, and then compare that to the real world, in this case the real world of higher education. Okay, so what is normally called the ivory tower, as I said, not something I'm very happy with. But looking then at the real situation of translator educators, and then situating translator education in the general context of teaching in higher education. Now, this is something that is not done a great deal in translation studies literature. And I think it is a weakness of our discipline in general that we have a tendency to stay on the margins, stay on the periphery of mainstream higher education. And I don't think we do ourselves any favors by doing that. So I'd like to situate the discussion of translator educators within professional standards for teaching in higher education. Then I would like to run through a profile of trainer competence, similar, if you like, to the competence profile for professional translators, but in this case for translator educators. And quickly look also at some of the instruments which we have available in the discipline for trainer training. I do not think we will have time to look in any depth at the instrument which I designed for needs analysis for translator educator training, in particular in Spain some years ago, but I will be happy. In any case, you will have the full presentation, so you will have all the data from that study, and I'll be very happy to exchange emails or comments in the Q&A session about that later. So let's just have a quick look at some of the quotes about translator educators, about trainers. And I'm using educators and trainers indistinctly. I am aware that they reflect a difference of approaches, but I'm using them indistinctly because the literature uses them also in a fairly similar way. I should perhaps say, however, that whether I use the term trainer or whether I use the term educator, I situate myself much closer to the educator paradigm than to the trainer paradigm. But simply for facility of communication, I'll be using both. The quotes I have chosen not because they are current and up to date, but because they reflect major approaches to trainer profiles within our discipline. These approaches are very, very deeply embedded, and I do not think that there has been any great change. And as I said, I have seen this over the years in various different waves of new translation programs in countries around the world. And the first quote I would like to look at is by Don Kirley, whom, as you know, works at the University of Germersheim in Germany. And this is in fact from his first book, so before his very clearly seminal work in translator education, his 2000 book on a social constructivist approach to translator education. But already in his first book in '95, he worked a great deal on the concept, on the idea of the translator's self-concept, on the importance of the translator's self-concept in order for them actually to socialize into the profession. And what he says about trainers is it cannot be expected that language instructors without professional translation expertise will have a professional translator self-concept themselves, or that they will be able to help their translation students develop one. Okay, so he is clearly advocating here professional competence, professional expertise in the field of translation for all trainers. He believes that those who do not have that professional expertise will have difficulty in actually fulfilling their role of educating and socializing students into what is a very, very professional sector. It's interesting that he specifically mentions language instructors because this, of course, reflects a tendency, which again we have seen repeated in waves over the years in different countries, a tendency of universities at institutional level to go into translation studies and to offer translation programs because they have a languages department which is at risk, because they have a lot of tenured staff, whom they need to keep occupied. And they see that traditional language programs are not attractive, are not recruiting students, whereas translation is an exciting discipline and something which attracts students. And so very often language instructors have found themselves in this situation where they've had to adapt and found themselves required to teach courses in very, very professional skills which they themselves do not have. So this is a recurrent feature in translation studies literature when we talk about trainer profiles. The second version of this is considerably more extreme. It comes from our colleague Daniel Guadec, retired now from the University of Rennes in France. Professor Guadec is well known in the field of translator education because of his work in setting up a program which simulates professional activity. So practically the entire master's program at the University of Rennes was a simulation of a translation agency. Continues to be, although I believe perhaps not exactly as when Professor Guadec was responsible for the program. So Professor Guadec is, if you like, one of the strongest proponents of the need for very, very professional and very market-oriented work, both with students and for trainers. So in reply to a question from our colleague currently at the University of Melbourne, but situated permanently in the University of Tarragona, Rovira i Virgili, Anthony Pym. In response to Anthony's question, how should trainers be trained? Daniel Guadec's response is, well, another simple answer to a simple question. I would beg to differ. I don't think it's a simple question. I think it's a very complex question. Teachers on translator training programs should spend 1 month in all three of the following situations. Working in a translation firm, either as a translator or a reviser or a terminologist. Working in an in-house translation service, same as above. And being a freelance professional, same as above. And he says that should be enough for a start. And that should clearly determine on their teaching approaches. Okay, again, insistence on the professional side of the profile for trainers. That is perhaps the assumption that most trainers are not professional, have not had this professional experience, and I think that is worrying. Quite how this very professional expertise determines on teaching approaches is not clear. It's not clear from the response. And that would bring me on to a third position from translation studies literature. And here we're going a little bit further back in time, but the quote says, shall we say, the quote encapsulates this issue as I would like to put it to you. And that is a quote from Christine Durieux from her book on scientific and technical translation, originally published in French, so the translation is mine, where she says, it is certainly enriching for students at translation schools to have professional translators as teachers, but this is not without its problems. And what she says is, professional translators like specific training. So here we have the other side of the coin. Christine Durieux, before she became a translator teacher, before she joined academia, was a professional translator. And what she is reflecting here is her own difficulties in moving from the professional world into academia. And unlike the previous quotes, identifies a lack not in professional expertise, but in training in the academic world, in teaching as such. Okay, so, sorry.
Michael, again, sorry to interrupt you again. I'm terribly sorry.
It's okay. No, it's okay.
We're getting a little bit of feedback from your mic.
What should I do about that?
Try moving it away from your mouth a little bit.
Let's see.
Now talk to me. Say hello, Michael.
Hello. Is that better?
Yeah.
Hello, is that better?
Yeah. Does it sound better?
It's
The
better.
fuzz has gone away. Yep.
The fuzz has gone. I have just realized that the little foamy bit has disappeared from the mic, and I wonder if that has something to do with it.
That's exactly the problem. That thing is a windscreen.
Right.
So so it's fine if it's gone. I think it's better now that
it's better now. It's moving away. What I don't know is where it's gone.
Yeah.
And if I could find it, I would put it back on.
Those windscreens actually block all of that air. So any air movement like breath and things like that.
Yeah. The problem being, of course, I do need to continue breathing.
Yeah. It does seem like a thing you should keep doing.
Yeah.
So,
okay, I'm sorry. I can't find the little foamy bit, but if I find it, I will make sure that tomorrow it is there.
Yeah, and I think it's a little better as long as it's a little farther from your face.
Okay.
I'll turn the sound up here if I need to.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt again.
No, please do. Please do. It gives me greater interactivity as well. It gives me a greater feeling of being with you. So that's fine. That's fine. Okay, having looked at those 3 different quotes from different periods, different areas and different profiles about translator educators in translation studies, I would like now to come down to earth and look at the real world. Now, I said here the real world of higher education. And for this, what I have done is to take a real position so that we can really have a look at what a professional translator educator has to do. Now, I think this is very important because my impression from reading the previous quotes is we're thinking an awful lot just about what happens in the classroom. But as any of us who have been involved in teaching know, what happens in the classroom is only a small part of what we do as educators. I'm sure many of you have had the situation where by the end of May, your neighbors and friends are saying, well, you'll be on holiday now, won't you? And everyone assumes that academics have nothing to do if they are not in the classroom. Okay. Well, let's have a look at a job advertisement, because I think this tells us a lot about what academics do when they're in the classroom, but also when they're not in the classroom. This is Railway. I have not modified this in any way. So a position advertised for full-time faculty to teach a full load. Okay, now, teaching a full load can mean a lot of different things in different countries. Also, teaching a full load will mean a lot of different things in terms of group sizes and group numbers and so on in different contexts. But clearly, full load and full-time faculty would imply that that is, as the term itself indicates, a full-time job. So you'll not have a lot of time for other things. But let's have a look at what this advertisement says about the person who's going to get the job. The person who gets this full-time job to teach a full load will gradually assume additional academic and curricular duties, such as, so it's not an exhaustive list, serving on committees, directing student theses, conducting research, acting as program head, where administrative duties include advising students, organizing exam sessions, reviewing student applications, coordinating staffing assignments, participating in student recruiting events. Okay, and I'm sure that any of you in the room who are teachers could add things to that list. And you would know that they naturally fall into part of the work of an academic today. Notice, please, that conducting research is just one little line there. It's in third place of additional academic duties, when we all know that academics today, most academics today, live in a context where they must research, so publish or perish. There is constant evaluation of research activity, research output, and so on. So that one little line there is rather unfair for what is a huge chunk of an academic's time. And then this advertisement goes on to say, okay, so we are looking for a highly experienced translator and/or conference interpreter ready to shift his or her primary focus to teaching while remaining active in the profession. Now, I don't know about you, but I find this advertisement profoundly disturbing. Because I don't know how many full-time jobs this advertisement describes. We're looking for someone who can teach, we're looking for someone who will research, we're looking for someone who will do a lot of admin as part of the life of an academic institution. And at the same time, we're saying, okay, but we expect you to be a highly experienced translator or interpreter. We expect you to move your primary focus to teaching, but of course, we would expect you to continue to translate and to interpret. This is the real world of educator profiles, and one which I believe a lot of our junior colleagues suffer greatly with. Okay, that said, let's move a little bit deeper into teaching, into just the teaching aspect, okay? We have said it's a very complex role. It's a role where there are a lot of demands, a lot of, in my view, conflicting demands made of young people, particularly pre-tenure, depending on the system you're working in, young academics. Within teaching, which, as I said, is only one part of most young academics' role, I'd like just to have a fairly quick look at what are professional standards for teaching in higher education. And I'd like to insist a little bit on the professional, on the adjective professional there, because the given in translation studies that in order to train translators, in order to teach translation at university, you have to be a professional. The assumption behind that professional is you have to be a professional translator or interpreter, I think is misleading, I think is misguided, and ignores the fact that being an academic, that working full-time in higher education and research is a profession in itself. And I would just like to underline a little bit about professional standards for teaching in higher education. Now, I'm using the version of the UK Higher Education Academy's Professional Standards Framework from 2006. There are similar frameworks in many different countries. I find this one is very clear, which is why I'm using it. And it looks at three various different areas of activity, core knowledge, and professional values. Now, I think the point on professional values is an important point. Professional values as academics, as teachers, as educators. But let's just run through what the HEA says about what a higher education professional does and should know. In areas of activity, they describe 6 major areas of activity. The first is design and planning of learning activities and/or programs of study. Now, we spoke about this on Monday, and we looked at the complexity of the design and planning of learning activities, the design and planning in particular of programs of study. But it is the first area of activity which is identified by the HEA. The second is that of teaching and/or supporting student learning. Increasingly, the balance would be supporting student learning as opposed to teaching in the traditional sense. But it means, of course, not only in the classroom, it means also outside the classroom, and it means in virtual formats such as this, which I'm sure the new generation will come to terms with much better than in my generation. The third area of activity is that of assessment and giving feedback, and I touched on this briefly the other day. Assessment not only in the sense of summative assessment, not only in the sense of this is okay, this is not okay, but rather in the sense of assessment for learning, giving feedback to learners, and ensuring that assessment helps them on the learning process. The development of effective environments and student support and guidance. We spoke about learning spaces. Learning spaces are important, but it's also what you do with the learning spaces that are important. A colleague said to me the other day, I have this horrible, typical, traditional amphitheater where I have to give my classes, but I've actually managed to find ways in which I can ensure that they are interactive and so on. So it's what you do with the learning spaces you have, rather than simply saying, oh, I have this horrible classroom, I can't do what I want to do. It is, and this is very important, the integration of scholarship, research, and professional activities with teaching and supporting learning. And it is the evaluation of practice and continuing professional development. The evaluation of practice as an educator, the evaluation of practice as a teacher, and continuing professional development as a teacher. This, in many higher education environments, is something which is not paid a great deal of attention. In many of the more traditional higher education environments, it is assumed, and we will come back to this a little bit later, contrary to the popular saying that those who know can teach. But we all know that teaching is a very complex activity, and there is a need for training in teaching. There is a need for professional development and continuing professional development. Core knowledge would be the second major area which the Higher Education Academy looks at. That is, what does a professional educator need to know? And if we look at what we saw in our translation studies literature, we will see that it is generally assumed, and I think you will find this across the board, that what our discipline requires of teachers is that they should have professional translation expertise. Okay, so they should have a knowledge and understanding of the subject material. But as you can see, the Higher Education Academy identifies another 5 areas. Appropriate methods for teaching and learning in the subject area and at the level of the academic program, which would immediately imply that it is not the same to teach first year bachelor's level as to teach final year postgraduate level, master's level. Knowledge and understanding of how students learn, both in general and in translation studies. And here, I think the work on translator competence acquisition by the PACTE research group in Barcelona is of particular interest to teachers in the field of translation. The use of appropriate learning technologies. Very often when we speak about IT and we speak about technologies in the field of translator education, everyone automatically assumes that we're talking about computer-assisted translation, we're talking about terminology management tools, we're talking about the translation tools. And very, very little mention and very little work is done on the learning technologies. The 5th point is methods for evaluating the effectiveness of teaching. So we're not talking here about student assessment, we're talking about how we evaluate our activity as teaching, which of course is directly linked to point 6, the implications of quality assurance and enhancement for professional practice, for the professional practice of teaching in higher education. And a final look at teacher profiles from the perspective of professional values. Any profession has its professional values, linked, of course, to ethics, both personal ethics, professional ethics, but also collective ethics. And I think some of these points are very interesting. And certainly this would be one of the areas which I think is under-researched and under-dealt with in translator education research. The first is respect for individual learners, increasingly important in higher education, where we are very fortunately now seeing widening access, where we are seeing very different publics coming into higher education, participating in higher education. And this interestingly calls into question some of the givens from our own discipline, where very often academics are very, very set in their ways regarding the need for very, very strict selection of students. And the diversity in the classroom and widening access is an issue which has posed a great deal of difficulty, perhaps more in conference interpreting than in translation, but has certainly posed difficulty in institutions around the world. The second is commitment as academics to incorporating the process and outcomes of relevant research, scholarship, and/or professional practice. The third is the commitment to the development of learning communities. The fourth, commitment to encouraging participation in higher education. This is linked to the first, acknowledging diversity and promoting equality of opportunity. The fifth, commitment to continuing professional development and evaluation of practice. Okay, so this would be, if you like, a more general framework for academics in general in higher education with regard to the teaching side of their activity. This is not about research, it's not about administration, it's not about management. A couple of other quotes perhaps here just for a short break, because I like this quote from Gibson. The quote is from the British Medical Journal, okay? So we're not talking here about translator educators, but we're talking about the excellent university teacher, which is perhaps what we should all be aspiring to. And Gibson sums these up in 5 E's. The first E is education. Okay, logical. The second, experience. The third, enthusiasm, linked of course to motivating students and so on. The fourth, ease, being comfortable in the classroom, doing what you're doing. And the last one I love, eccentricity. We could question whether all excellent university teachers have to be eccentric, but I think it's an interesting pointer towards, shall we say, creativity in the classroom at the very least. So those are not professional standards, those are aspirations in the world of medical education, where very interestingly, a great deal of work has been done on how to educate future doctors. A lot of work, a lot of very innovative work has been done. It's something that perhaps we could look at. Okay, and just one final quote, this is from a European level document, European Union high-level group on the modernization of higher education, which produced a couple of years ago a report on improving the quality of teaching and learning in Europe's higher education institutions. I'm not going to go through the whole document, although I have several slides on it. You can have a look at them yourselves later on, and I can, of course, give you the link to the document itself. But I think interesting just to look again at these two little paragraphs. The first one says, the best teaching and learning environments encourage students to develop confidence in their own creative abilities, strong community engagement, and a sense of ethical responsibility, allied to the humility that comes from understanding that learning is a lifelong phenomenon that demands curiosity and commitment. That is a fairly short sentence with an awful lot of content. The second is, a good teacher, like a good graduate, is also an active learner, questioner, and critical thinker. The good teacher aims to help the student be confident in handling the subject as it has developed so far, to be courageous in openness to new ideas, curious enough to seek new solutions and opportunities, and insightful enough to work well with others so the flow of information and effort is maximized. So I think you will see that these are very much in line with the Higher Education Academy standards which I mentioned before. They're ambitious, but I think they are clearly what we as academics in the classroom and in our teaching activity need to aspire to. Now, as I said, I'm not going to go through the other recommendations of this report, although I think they're very interesting recommendations, and I would encourage you perhaps to have a look at them if this subject is of interest to you. I myself attempted, just before I joined the European Masters in Translation Expert Group, to define model trainer competence. And I went about this in a fairly similar way to what I did when I was trying to model translator competence. That is, with a multi-componential approach, which again is not simply a list, although here it appears as a list, because each of these areas is very, very strongly interconnected, and where one is lacking, another will come in to make up for it, to compensate, and so on. But I think there are three major areas if we apply the ideal profile of a translator to, of a higher education teacher to our discipline as such. The first major area would be what our translation studies literature requires, time and again, that is professional translation competence or expertise, which is not to say that the person who has that competence or expertise is actually active in the profession at the same time as they are active in teaching and learning. It is, in fact, legally impossible in many contexts to be active in both at the same time. So these are things which we should not demand of our teachers. But the knowledge, the expertise does need to be there. The second area would be knowledge of translation studies as an academic discipline. That is familiarity with translation theories, familiarity with research and ongoing research in the field, familiarity with how our discipline is constructed. We have a very complex discipline. We have a very complex, very multifaceted discipline. And of course, no single translator educator is going to be up to date on absolutely everything that is happening from every theoretical approach within the discipline because of its complexity. But a sound basis in the discipline is, of course, essential. And then the third area of competence is that of teaching. So picking up a little bit on what we've seen in the Higher Education Academy texts, I'd like to just run through what we mean by teaching competence, what an educator should be able to do. I'm not going to look at the professional competence because we spoke about it the other day, but of course I would, in order to be coherent with my own work, use my own model of translator competence, but move beyond the implicit assumption in most academic environments, which is if you can, if you know, then you can teach. So if you are a geologist, you know how to teach geology. If you are a translator, you know how to teach translation, which I think very clearly is simply not true. To subdivide a little bit more these competences in teaching itself, I'm going to subdivide them into a series of areas. And these areas have actually been picked up again then by the European Masters in Translation, EMT, and a little bit further developed in a document which I will also give you a link to, but very much in this same direction. So what does a translator educator have to be able to do? On the organizational side, they need to be able to design courses and appropriate teaching and learning activities within those courses. And of course, at the appropriate level within the courses. They need to be able, firstly, to design, but secondly, to implement, to apply, and to manage. Of course, managing teaching and learning activities means managing a classroom, managing a group of people, understanding that every group of people, every group of learners is different, and understanding the dynamics within a group of learners and how to manage those for optimal learning to take place. And alongside that, designing and implementing and managing of teaching and learning activities, appropriate assessment activities. I already said, I believe on Monday, that probably these should all go together, in that teaching and learning should be intimately linked to assessment, or rather assessment should be intimately, closely linked to teaching and learning, because assessment is an essential part of helping the learning process. A second area is the interpersonal element. Teaching and learning are essentially, teaching in particular, is an interpersonal process. And therefore it is absolutely essential that anyone involved in education, anyone involved in teaching, should have the ability to work collaboratively with trainees, with learners, towards their learning goals. Here we sometimes have to deal with a discrepancy, and we discussed this on Monday, between the learning goals of the people in the classroom, the people registered on the program, and the intended learning outcomes of a program. And we mentioned that very often translation programs have learners who are not 100% committed to becoming professional translators, and that was something we need to bear in mind. But as part of the interpersonal skills of a translator educator, they do need to be able to identify any discrepancy in learning goals and deal with that. Very importantly, and something which in some academic environments does not necessarily happen a great deal, is the ability to work in a training team. Now, translation studies is very often, not always, but very often situated within the broader field of the humanities. And the humanities, if we compare them to other disciplines, have a very long-standing tradition of individual scholarship. Whereas many other disciplines have a long-standing tradition of teamwork, of working in research teams, which are then transposed also into teaching teams. I believe very, very strongly that the ability to work in a team as trainers, as teachers, is essential, and something that we need to promote. Amongst other reasons, because very often at a university, we looked at that terrible profile that was expected of the perfect academic. If we cannot ask each of our academics to fulfill that whole profile, something we can do institutionally is ensure that within a department, there is a team which fulfills that perfect profile and where we can share out responsibilities, knowledge, and so on. And finally, within this interpersonally, quite apart from the collaborative work with trainees, the ability to act as a mentor, to offer guidance, and so on to our learners. So interpersonal with the learners, interpersonal with other teachers. We could add, of course, interpersonal within the institution, something which in my current management role I am perhaps becoming increasingly aware of, but many junior colleagues are not as aware of at the beginning of their career. Then we have the purely instructional skill of how do we present content, how do we explain clearly, can we stimulate discussion and reflective thinking, how can we arouse interest and enthusiasm. And I should perhaps, as self-reflection here in the context we are in, say that I am coming to terms with the context and finding it a little bit difficult to stimulate discussion in the way I would normally do if I were there with you and walking around and stopping and asking questions and asking you to interact and so on. So I'm learning a great deal from this experience myself, I must thank you for that. A fourth area is the contextual and professional area of skills. And I believe that here again, there is a great deal of work to be done. Firstly, contextually. Translation studies has had a very strange history in higher education in that it has tended, on the whole, and I mentioned this a little bit before, to be on the margins of academia. Many of the first translation schools which were set up in very prestigious universities were set up as professional entities separate from academia, separate from the research. Many of them did not have doctoral cycles. Many of them did not actually have research activity. I remember very clearly when I myself studied in Geneva, the University of Geneva, one of the major problems which the head of the school was concerned with was that there was no research, there was no doctoral cycle, and there was a very clear need to integrate the translating and interpreting school much more into the mainstream of university life. And this is something which has happened again and again in many different countries. And I think this has meant very often that translation studies has been a very inward-looking discipline. I think if we link the fact that translation studies also from the 50s, 60s on has seen or has at least perceived itself to be permanently under siege, under attack, and unrecognized by academia, by the traditional and consolidated disciplines, this has led to this tendency to be inward-looking, to be very defensive. and not to take into account always the full context. So the full context of higher education in general, the full context of university, the full context of national university systems, or the local context. And I do still find this, speaking to colleagues, there is not necessarily a great deal of engagement with the debate on the future of higher education, with the debate on the major tendencies in higher education, but rather a tendency to look at the future of translation, the future of translation studies. And I think we need to combine both. Similarly, perhaps, and again, this has come from the discourse of difference and the discourse of reaffirmation as a profession and as an academic discipline, full understanding of the teaching profession beyond translation studies is something that I think we also need to work on a lot more than we do today. And finally, at a very instrumental level, knowledge of training resources of all kinds. Those can be technological resources, they can be bibliographical resources, but they can also be teaching methodologies, the use of group work, the use of teamwork, the use of pairs, full traditional lectures, and so on and so forth. So, and different kinds of assessment approaches and so on, and how we can apply them appropriately and usefully to the training process. Now, having said all of that and looked very much at what we need to do and all of these various different areas of competence which we need to develop, just some words on available resources. How do we do this? How do we ensure that those who are commencing a career as translator educators, or who are changing career and moving into translator education, actually are aware of what is available and actually receive training? I'm going to mention some resources. Of course, there are more, but there are not very many systematic resources for trainer training in the field of translation studies. So I think, again, something that as a discipline we need to work more on. And I think we are currently, in the context of the Nida School, in a very interesting instance of an initiative to promote what I would understand to be at least one aspect of trainer training. Let's look first of all at the literature. Of course, there are, within the literature on translation studies, there is now a growing body of literature on translator education, which goes beyond the very initial literature, which was very much a description of my program. This is how my program is structured, or a description of what I do in the classroom. I do this. And I believe that we have now moved forward a little. We have a fairly extensive amount of conference proceedings with published with elements of translator education. We have a growing number of collective volumes. Since 2007, and I'm very proud to have been part of the initiative, we have a journal devoted entirely to interpreter and translator training, ITT. Originally at St. Jerome, today at Routledge. And just a quick, perhaps, comment here, a quick aside to say that it's a very nice problem to have, but one of the problems that we have at ITT is that there is now a growing amount of research being done and a growing amount of research being submitted to the journal, to the extent that it is actually quite hard for those of us who are running the journal to keep up. And currently, time to publish is between 18 and 24 months at the journal, which we are aware is a very, very long time. As I said, it's a good problem to have in the sense that it means there's a lot of work happening in the field of translator education and interpreter education. But it is a problem which we need to deal with internally in the journal. There is, however, and I think this is very important, perhaps more than the actual typical publication in journals, in volumes, and so on. In translator education, there is a huge amount of grey literature, a huge amount of literature in the form of teaching projects, in the form of teaching innovation, in the form of documents written in competitions to win posts as academics in the field of translation studies, which is then not disseminated. And I think we still have a problem with the lack of dissemination of good practice. And this is something which I think collectively we need to work on. Perhaps firstly, internally within our institutions, we need to make sure that we speak to each other, that we coordinate with our colleagues, but also I think across institutions. And here, of course, associations play a leading role. I'm just going to mention some associations which have some involvement in translator education. The first, of course, would be the Translation Studies Associations themselves, the European Society for Translation Studies or the International Association for Translation and Intercultural Studies. But then more specifically linked to translator education, we have associations such as SUTI. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with SUTI or not, and as I said, because I can't really see your reactions, I'm not 100% sure, so I will perhaps just stop to say that SUTI is a standing conference of translating and interpreting institutes at universities, founded in the 50s or 60s. I don't have the exact date in my mind right now, but in order to guarantee and promote the quality of translator training. SUTI is very selective regarding membership, and so belonging to SUTI is a kind of a quality seal for any translation program. Initially, of course, very Europe-oriented, but in recent years has opened up globally and now has, for example, a growing number of Chinese members. Alongside SUTI, there has been a very recent initiative, which I think it's important to mention, which is the World Interpreter and Translator Training Association, set up from Guangzhou in China, and about to hold its second international conference in October in London. This is a very different association to SUTI. There has been some confusion, I think, at the beginning, where it was understood that perhaps this was competition for an existing institution. WITA is a very open association for those interested in translator and interpreter training in general, and particularly interesting in that it has a particular emphasis on Asia, where, as I said, the growth in translator programs is exponential, and therefore there is a very clear need for work on translator training and, in particular, trainer training. And there are also a fairly large number of national associations, conferences of translator programs. And I should perhaps also add to this list of associations a network such as the European Masters in Translation Network, which is a network of programs which have received the quality seal from the European Commission for their translation programs, and which from 2009 on has devoted quite some time to developing a translator trainer profile and to trying to help institutions who are setting up new programs to ensure that their trainers have the right profile and to help them with staff development. Some master's and doctoral programs in translation studies will take into account that anyone going into the profession, the academic profession, going into academia, will very often, quite apart from being a researcher, be a teacher. There are doctoral summer schools like this one, like the one that we are participating in this week and next. Another example would be the DOTTSS summer school, which has, since its inception 6 years ago, by the University of Ljubljana, always had a component in translator education alongside its component in translation studies. And then there have been a series of initiatives by different universities and different researchers in translator education around the world to help academics to further their competence as trainers. And I'm thinking particularly of initiatives by Anthony Pym, by Daniel Guadek, by Maria Gonzalez Davis with Don Kirley, or by Maya Pietrowska in Krakow. So a number of initiatives which do exist in order to help young academics to develop their teaching skills. I am not, as I said, going to have time, because I see my 60 minutes are pretty much up, to look at the needs analysis instrument which I developed in order to identify training needs, but I will perhaps just say one thing, and that is, like translator education itself, any trainer training, any educator education, needs to be based on the same principles of needs analysis. That is, we need to know who our learners are. We need to know what skills, what competences they already have. We need to adapt any training to those particular learners. And that is exactly why using instruments from the Higher Education Academy and researchers in staff development at universities, I developed a questionnaire to attempt to profile training needs at translating and interpreting departments in Spain. And I think, mention in particular the results. As I said, I'm not going to go into any detail, but one of the major results was that a major area of concern for translator educators was that of assessment, was that of developing assessment tools, assessment resources, and that was one of the areas where they felt, even the most experienced of translator educators felt least confident and most concerned that they were perhaps not doing their job as well as they should. You will have, when you receive the presentation, all these results, which, as I said, I'm not going to comment on now. And you will also then be able to see just all of the various different elements that we took into account when we developed the survey and what the situation is in Spain today. One final word before we move into question and answer sessions then is, contrary to the those who can do, those who can't teach, which you will all be familiar with, there is a given in higher education in general that those who can teach. And that is indeed probably the case. But I think it is essential to remember that in order to be able to teach, in order to be able to facilitate learning in our discipline, but in fact in any discipline, teachers need to have a complex set of competences, and we've run through many of the elements which form part of that set of competences, which goes well beyond that very, very early idea, you need to be a professional translator or interpreter, okay? Which is not to question that the essential, that the professional competence in translating or interpreting is, of course, essential, but it is only the first of many elements. And I think that would be my conclusion for the moment. So thank you once again for your attention, and over to you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Okay, we do have time for some Q&A, so we'll need to pass the microphone around.
Yeah.
Questions.
I just have a teeny tiny question. Thank you for such a great, inspiring, informative talk. You've mentioned the need to engage with a full understanding of the teaching profession today.
Mm-hmm.
My teeny tiny question. I know you cannot talk about that, but I wonder if you could just give us a couple of pointers about how that context of teaching and higher education today has an impact on teaching, educating in translation studies.
Okay. Let me give one example, which in fact we'll come back to tomorrow. One of the huge major tendencies in higher education today in the world is that of internationalization. For a very, very long time, universities, well, let's go back right to the beginning. Universities are born as very international institutions. And we can go back to a very idealized version of the medieval university and so on and so forth. But in the 19th century, universities become very national institutions, and they become very local in many, many ways. The local social mission becomes more important than a more international, a broader mission. And this continues today in many, many contexts, in the way in which universities are organized, in the way in which programs are organized, in the way in which students are selected for programs and so on. But at the same time, that structure is being questioned by an increasing internationalization, increasing freedom of movement on the part of students, increasing pressure from many countries where there are not sufficient universities to offer sufficient programs to their young people. Pressure also from authorities and institutions, which very often, I think, misguidedly and wrongly use international students as a way of making money. So a lot of different pressures, pushes and pulls, which are turning our universities into much more internationalized centers. And if we look at our translator training programs, we look at our translator education programs, the huge majority of them, the vast majority of them, were designed for a local public, for a very specific public. Okay? And in fact, very often, as I said, I'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow, but since in Europe, we've had the Erasmus program for student mobility, most of our translation institutions are heavily invested and heavily engaged with student mobility as an essential part of student learning. But we don't know what to do with the students who turn up in our classrooms. So yes, we're very, very happy for our students to go away and have this wonderful learning experience abroad. That's great. But of course, the other side of the coin is we receive students from all over Europe and now from all over the world. And we've designed our programs for local students with one language combination and so on and so forth. This simply as an example of how the global context of higher education, the global context of the teaching profession can have an impact on what's happening in our classroom, and how very, very often translation studies as a discipline hasn't quite reacted. There's still a lot of reaction to happen.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the informative presentation, Professor Kelly. I have a better understanding of the qualification required for professional, translation trainers. But I guess another important issue related to this professional qualification is the developmental trajectory for
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Developmental trajectory for the professional translation trainers. Like we have the developmental trajectory for professional translators. So do we have something similar for the trainers?
I think that is what it would be very, very good for us to have. And I think the idea which I had when I tried to model trainer competence was very similar to modeling translator competence. Mm-hmm. And when we look at designing ways in which to improve or to help people to acquire translator competence, by analogy, of course, we would need to be looking at how to help people develop the competence to be professional translator educators. And that's a little bit what I was talking about at the end with the various resources which are available, but which to my mind are still perhaps not as systematic as would be desirable in order to help to develop professional translator educators. And certainly in the numbers which are needed, I think in particular of China today, where with 270 BTI, MTI programs, 270 universities offering programs, yes, there is a huge need for professional translator educators, yes, which I believe Chinese institutions are struggling with a great deal. And I empathize because I remember in Spain when we had, on a much smaller scale, to try to provide sufficient professional translator educators for 20-odd universities. Now you're multiplying that by 10. And I think it is certainly something which as a discipline we need to take on board. Yeah.
That's why I'm asking this question, because we have very tricky situation in China. We have a huge demand for professional translation educators, and now most of the professional translation educators or teachers in China has a diverse backgrounds like linguistics, literature, and very few of them have the experience of the professional translators. So it's important to figure out how these teachers of a variety of backgrounds developed into or evolve into a qualified.
Absolutely. I think it's something which universities do not necessarily do very well. And here I'll start with my own university. Yesterday when we were looking at curricular development, yesterday on Monday when we looked at curricular design, we said one of the essential steps in curricular design is to identify the resources you need and to make sure you have them and you have them on board before you actually launch the program. Now, I would say that universities in general don't do that very well. They may do the sort of physical resources. Okay, we need a place, we need classrooms, we need computers, we need a library. But the teaching resources is something which is not normally planned for well. And I know of, I'm going to put my neck out here and say, I know of no university which has actually set up a program to ensure that it has sufficient academic staff trained as translator educators before they have launched their program. The problems come later, when the students start to say this is not working, when the industry starts to say the students are not well prepared because they're not learning what they need to learn, and so on and so forth. And that is when institutions are starting to react. And I couldn't agree with you more that it's a major, major problem.
Thank you.
Okay, go.
Yes, thank you for that excellent